This is the Get a Life Podcast, Ex-Cult Conversations.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Lane, and I'm here today with the regular crew, Cheryl, Carmen, and Richard. And our guest today is Craig Hoyle. Craig, where are you coming to us from?
Hi team, I'm coming to you from Auckland, New Zealand, where it is the first day of summer, but it is raining.
Well, we're freezing here in Canada. So, Craig, how many years have you been out of the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church?
So I left in 2009, which is 13, coming up 14 years ago. I left, I was 19 at the time. So it's been a while now. Most of my adult life has been out of the PBCC.
Yeah. So the listeners here in Canada and even in the States don't really know too much about your story. I've known you for a long time, right? We met after both of us were pretty recently leaving, I think, only maybe a year or two out. I don't know. But your story is so special, and because it just exposes the levels that the Plymouth Brethren will go to in their hatred. I don't know where you want to start. I don't know where you want to dive into, but why don't you just tell us how it began that you left the Plymouth Brethren?
That's a complicated question, Lane. Yes, as I was saying, I left when I was 19, but the process began sort of quite a few years before that. After I realized that I was gay and came out to the priests. Because realizing that you're gay yourself and coming out at two different points. So I first started to realize that I was gay would have been around when I was 13 or so. At that point, the New Zealand government was pushing through legislation for civil unions, and the exclusive brethren, as they then called themselves, were very vocal in campaigning against that. And the irony of the brethren campaigning against civil union equality for the rainbow community is that it was my first awareness that that community existed. And so learning that there might be other people out there like me happened in a very toxic place. And so it took a few years before I was prepared to admit to myself that that might be me, and B, before I was prepared to tell anyone else about it. And the telling other people about it came about, as is the Brethren way, through confessions, because at that point I was working through everything I thought I needed to confess to get my life on track. And I had confessed to all of my sins. You go through and every last little thing you think you might have done wrong, you end up airing to the priests at those meetings for me, they were often on a Friday night, half cut on a bottle of whiskey with one of the priests, sometimes two of the priests. And so I eventually, I knew I'd confessed everything that I could think of, but I knew that the being gay thing was the one that was still hanging over me. And that was different kind of sin, as they would say it, because everything else I'd confessed was something I had done, whereas this was something that I was. And that's a much deeper thing to confess to a couple of priests.
Priests.
Yeah, use that term loosely, as they do. And eventually, it was on a Friday night, and I confessed to one of the local priests, and basically he could see that I had something big to confess, and so he just kept pushing the scotch at me until I was drunk enough to get there. And even then I couldn't bring myself to say it, so I wrote on a piece of paper, I'm gay, and pushed it across the table at him.
How old were you?
18.
Holy cow.
And so that confession kicked off a whole process. So one of the first things that he did was get in touch with the Hales in Sydney, And so very quickly, BDH was aware of my circumstances, as was Daniel Hales, his brother. And somewhere around that point, Ethel Green also got involved. Of course, that's BDH's father-in-law. So there was absolutely no doubt that as soon as I had confessed that I was gay, that information went straight to the top. And those leaders, interestingly, they told all of these very senior people in the Brethren hierarchy, but never told my parents. And so a lot of what unfolded over the next year or so happened with my parents sort of really being kept in the dark about the circumstances and what had happened and what the Brethren were doing as a result. And looking back, I think it came as quite a shock to my parents to learn what had been going on.
Wow.
But the Brethren, led, I think, by BDH and the senior leaders, but implemented by the local leaders, went through, began a program of trying to help me change my sexuality in Invercargill that didn't look like, which is where I grew up, that didn't really have much of a practical face to it. It was much more, confessing your sins and working through it and telling me that, maybe I had been possessed by demons and that I needed to plead with God to help me change. And at that point, I really did believe that it was possible to change. And it built to a head in December 2017, when Bruce Hales, BDH Bruce Hales Jr., as some of the older people would know him, came to Invercargill for special church meetings, and they'd arranged for me to have a one-on-one audience with him after the meeting. And so I talked to Bruce Hales, and of course this was it was a huge deal to be given an audience with
He's
the
the
elect
Pope.
vessel.
He's just like the Pope, so it's a massive ordeal for you, of course.
You're getting a word direct from God, and it could make or break your future.
Yeah.
And so I talked to Bruce Hales after this meeting, and expecting that he would be able to sort of wave his hands and cure my sexuality. I really did think it would be that easy.
Wow. But yeah, that's what we believe, right?
Yep.
And of course that didn't happen. He told me that that there was no future in being gay, and that I should never accept myself for who I was. And he also made the comment, there's medication you can go on for these things. Now he was about to rush off to the next set of church meetings, and so he left, and then I left not long after that, because of course Bruce Hales had said he wanted to continue the conversation, and so what that meant was that I was basically stuck following Bruce Hales across the countryside until we got to talk again.
So you were automatically put into his entourage.
Yes, I wasn't traveling with his entourage directly, but I was immediately put onto the bus that was traveling, sort of associated to his entourage. Okay. And so we ended up in Oamaru, which is about 3 hours north of Invercargill. Didn't have a chance to talk to him there, and so carried on to Timaru, which is another hour north. And it was in Timaru that I finally crossed paths with him again a day or two later. And that second encounter was much more about talking to Dr. Roger Kirkpatrick, who of course is another Brethren leader. He's also one of their few doctors, and he is also a cousin of Bruce Hales. Roger Kirkpatrick's mother was a Hales. And so they arranged for me to have an audience with Roger Kirkpatrick at the home of one of the local priests in Timaru. And Roger Kirkpatrick took me outside, and we sat. I still remember it very clearly. There's a green fence, there's a big tree in the front yard, and we sat on this concrete wall running alongside the driveway, and Kirkpatrick's face was, they were serving alcohol to everyone at this event. This was before the main fellowship meeting, and so this was the meal and associated drinking that was happening in the home beforehand. And I still remember it, Roger Kirkpatrick, his face flushed pink, and he's a very large man. You would probably remember him, Lane, but lowering himself very gingerly down onto this narrow concrete wall, and it was a very, very personal level of questioning from Roger Kirkpatrick, along the lines of what I was sexually attracted to and what had I done with whom, and sort of what turned me on. And it got down to the level of did I prefer a penis soft or hard, and
Oh, wow.
did I prefer penetrating or being penetrated? And he also explicitly asked if I was sexually attracted to the priest that had heard my first confession. So incredibly detailed, and it left me feeling, in retrospect, I would recognize that I was violated, but at the time, those feelings, a brethren person would more commonly associate it with guilt.
Well, that's what they teach us, right? Is that, oh, that's guilt. That's guilt. When really we're embarrassed, because these questions, Craig, are disgusting. Like, nobody, not even your doctor, needs details of your sex life like that, right? Like where do they think they get the right?
Yes. Of course, I had no concept of that at the time. No concept of the fact that he might be acting outside of professional boundaries. And Roger Kirkpatrick said that he couldn't prescribe any medication because we were in New Zealand and he was an Australian doctor, so he was outside of jurisdiction. But he told me that being gay was constitutional and would be a very, very difficult thing to change. And I saw Bruce Hales again in the home briefly after that. You know, he asked how it had gone, and then off we all went to the fellowship meeting. And it was a really dispiriting encounter because, first of all, I had assumed that it would be possible to easily change, and it turned out it wasn't. And not only this, but Roger Kirkpatrick was telling me that it was constitutional and be very difficult to change. But at the same time, Bruce Hales was telling me to never accept myself for who I was. And so it was sort of this impossible situation where there was not really any positive outcome, and I was just going to be left to struggle through life in the brethren, accepting that my life was terrible. And that seemed like too much to accept at that point. And so it was later that week, actually, it was just a few days later, I packed my bag and ran away for the first time. I was 18 at this point, and made it as far as Christchurch, which is 6-7 hours north of Invercargill. It's the main largest city in the South Island of New Zealand, and started making contact with people on the outside, including family. Didn't take the brethren long to track me down, and I later found out that they'd had people watching ferry terminals and airports and checking major cities. Basically, they put out their spy network when people go missing like that.
Yeah.
And the network found me in Christchurch, and they tracked me down, and some cousins of mine persuaded me to go back and just stay the night with them. You know how it is. And this is the thing with the brethren, is they deploy people that you love and care about.
Yeah.
And if you're in a bit of a shaky headspace, or if you're a bit emotional about what's happening, as of course you are,
Everyone was.
And then they send in people that you love and care about. It's very, very difficult to reject those people, because you know they're acting out of love, and you know they do care for you, and it adds that extra layer of guilt where in stepping away from the church, you're throwing that love from those people back in their faces.
Well,
So-
we're not, but that's what they make us feel, right? Like that's what they try and make us feel.
Well, yes, and we're jumping ahead a bit here, but a long time later I realized that unfortunately being true to yourself sometimes means hurting the people that you care about.
Yeah.
But that's sort of not really any excuse not to do what's right. And so going back to Christchurch, my cousins found me, reeled me back in. I was sent to live with an uncle and aunt in Palmerston North briefly, and from there I was sent to live in Sydney. And I think what had been going on behind the scenes was sort of high-level discussions between the leaders in New Zealand with Bruce Hales, perhaps realizing that I was more troubled than they had first thought, and that perhaps I needed a bit more encouragement to choose the right path forward. So yes, it was. They were known as encouragement trips. I don't know if this was. You'd remember the encouragement trips, Lane.
Oh, I haven't heard that term in a long time. Oh, ugh. They're not encouraging at all.
But they do that in China a lot, don't they? With those Uyghurs, they send them on encouragement trips to kind of concentration camps to try and change their political views a little. It's the same principle.
Yeah.
So yes, I was sent on an encouragement trip to Sydney, and the encouragement trips were when we were a young person who was going through a difficult set of circumstances, or was perhaps being a bit of a troublemaker, would be plucked out of obscurity and then sent to have a very privileged experience. In my case, it was going to live in Sydney, which was where the elect vessel lived. Or some people got sent on sort of extended tours around the world. Cousins of mine were sent to various places, which was seen as a privilege, and of course it was difficult to travel without the brethren agreeing to it. But looking back on the practice now, what it really did was it disconnected people from the networks of friends and support that they had in their home localities. And if you pluck a teenager, if you pluck a teenager out of their home environment and just keep them on the move in different countries, makes it much, much harder for them to try and make plans and connect with their support people back home.
And did your parents know at this point what was going on and why you were doing this encouragement trip?
I'm not sure that they did. I do have a detailed timeline of exactly, because I was petrified that people would find out that I was gay, and so I had a list of everybody who knew and exactly what date they found out, and who told them, because I was like so set on keeping it all under wraps. So I would need to go back and check that to figure out exactly when my parents knew. But what they did know was very much on the edges. They were not privy to the cut and thrust of the private conversations that I was having with people like Bruce Hales. So yes, my encouragement trip took me to Sydney, and I lived in Sydney for a couple of months, which was an astonishing experience. Took me right up close and personal with Bruce Hales and people in his orbit. And it was a particularly interesting time. It was the first few years. I mean, we were well into Bruce Hales's reign by that point. He'd been the elect vessel for 6 or 7 years. And he'd well and truly stamped his authority on the Sydney meeting, but at the same time, he seemed obsessed with rewriting his father's legacy. And so we heard an awful lot about John Hales and how we had missed the benefit of his teachings and how terribly the Sydney brethren had treated him. And Sydney existed in this quite bizarre place where Sydney was the home of the man of God, and so Sydney was exalted above all else. But at the same time, Sydney was the locality that had withdrawn from John Hales 3 times. And so, like, Sydney was exalted and Sydney was trash. Like, you had these parallel beliefs tracking about the brethren in Sydney.
I've never,
the
yeah, that's interesting.
It's quite the paradox, eh? Yeah.
And there are a number of, we're getting sidetracking a little bit from
That's all right.
how they treated homosexuality, but some of the things that happened in Sydney were quite astonishing. The drinking, for one thing, I'd never ever seen brethren drink like that, and we drank a lot in New Zealand. But this was the first time I'd seen people drink to the level that they did. It was the first time I had heard drinking alcohol so explicitly linked to our spiritual worth. So I remember being told in Sydney, just by rank and file members, that you could determine the spiritual worth of a man by how strong he poured his scotch.
Wow. Wow. Oh my God.
And was it anything less than 50-50 Scotch and Coke meant that there was something quite significantly morally wrong.
Wow.
Oh, their IQ isn't very high, is it?
And I also vividly remember, because I don't know if any of you ever went to the main Brethren Hall in Ermington, but it's quite a busy main road. And I remember at one point someone, like one of the first people to leave the Ermington Hall after a service, realized that there was a booze breath check,
Police check
up the road. And so they rang back to the security, because there's security guards on the gates at Ermington. They rang back to the security guards and like, hey, can you just tell everyone as they're leaving the service that there's a booze check up the road, just in case you're still too drunk from all the scotch you had before going to church. You might want to change around who's driving or take a different route home.
And that shows how drunk they are, because this would be probably 2 or 3 hours later, right?
Okay.
Yes.
So a whole string of brethren vehicles driven by 12-year-olds proceed past the booze check.
Proceeding through the back alleys to avoid it.
Oh. Man. So you were months stuck in Sydney there. You see booze drinking, underage drinking, I'm assuming too, right?
Yeah. Now the other thing that, speaking of drinking, I remember going out for dinner with Bruce Hales. We were at the home of cousins of mine, actually, because I had some cousins in Sydney. And we went out for dinner and I was wedged in. I had Bruce Hales on my left and Tony McCorkell on my right.
Yeah.
Tony McCorkell being the spin doctor,
Yeah.
who has since died. But anyway, both Bruce Hales and Tony McCorkell were sizable people. And there was I wedged in on the little chair between them.
Oh, that's hilarious.
But oh my God, the whiskey that Bruce Hales put away. So he was drinking his whiskey. He would have a crystal tumbler, just a whiskey tumbler, which would be filled with ice, and then it would just be filled to the brim with neat scotch. Normally,
no water, no ginger ale, nothing.
No, nothing, just ice, and then to the brim with neat scotch. But he knocked back 5 of those before dinner had even started.
So 5 triples? 5 triples? And they're probably quadruples, but oh my God, that's 15 drinks.
Oh yeah, and then during dinner he switched to wine, And then once dinner was over, like went back to whatever else he'd been drinking, but he didn't seem drunk. That was what astonished me. And later that evening, we were gathering around the piano, as you did, you know, and what a privilege to be singing around the piano with the man of God. And we we were singing various songs, you know, the Old Rugged Cross and so on, and you know, I used to belt out those ones. And then someone suggested that we sing Candle in the Wind. It's just a moment of awkward silence as we all looked at each other, because we knew that Bruce Hales had banned singing songs by Elton John.
Oh, yes, that's right. Oh, I forgot about that. Oh, that's so funny. So what happened? Just dead silence?
Well, there's this like dead silence, and all of the young people looked at each other, and then Bruce Hales was like, "Yeah, let's sing that one."
Oh my God, that's funny. So then they so everybody sang it all of a sudden.
Everybody sang it, and I just remember this like cognitive dissonance of being like, I know very well that we're not allowed to be singing Elton John songs, and here's the man of God belting out Candle in the Wind.
That's when you stand up and say, and by the way, I'm gay.
Yeah, me too. It's not just
Oh, that is so funny. Wow. So just like, fuck the own rule that I made, you know? But I mean, they do that with everything. I mean, remember when digital cameras, he said he couldn't have digital cameras, he'd go to hell. Everyone uses digital cameras now. Sorry, go on. Oh, that is so funny.
So, yes. So, I had a number of interactions with Bruce Hales when I was in Sydney, and probably the most pivotal was a meeting in his office at Archway House, as the Hales business was called then, where we ran through various things and quite a close level of questioning from him about my sexuality as well, asking about when I had first been aware of this way. He was much more oblique with his questioning than Kirkpatrick had been. But on Hales's orders, I was then sent to talk to Mark Craddock, who was another Brethren doctor. And bearing in mind, there aren't many Brethren doctors left anywhere in the world, but particularly in Australia, because any that left went to uni in the 60s or earlier, before the ban on university came in. So Mark Craddock was one of the few remaining doctors, and he is a radiologist, but was at that point commonly used by the Brethren in a GP capacity, so prescribing and consulting and so on. And Mark Craddock ran through a similar line of questioning about my sexuality and various aspects of that, and he asked how gay I was, and I said I thought I was 100% gay. And he's like, no, but surely there must be like some small part of you that's not gay. And I was like, okay, well, just kind of going along with it. Well, I'm probably 95% gay. And he goes, well, that means you're 5% straight, so we'll work on that.
Oh my God, these people.
Mark Craddock seemed a little bit more aware than Roger Kirkpatrick, and he did say that at that point in time, he didn't know of any medication that could change a person's sexuality. However, he did say that he was experimenting with some other medication regimes on other young people in the Brethren, but hadn't yet had any success. But what he said was that in the absence of being able to change my sexuality immediately, they could at least suppress it altogether. So he prescribed suppressed, which is a hormonal suppressant that cuts off the supply of testosterone. So it's effectively a chemical castration that's typically used for people with prostate cancer, or for registered sex offenders, basically for any situation where you're needing to cut off testosterone and render someone impotent, which was what happened to me. And he wrote enough repeats of the medication for me to be able to take the drug for a year without ever seeing another doctor. And there was no discussion of potential side effects or what exactly the medication would do to my body. And it was basically, yeah, here's this quite powerful drug, just go away and take it. And here's 5 repeats in case you can't get back to see me soon.
Oh,
Did
my
he explain to
God.
you, like, did he go through and explain all that information on what it's normally used for? Or did you find that out later on in life?
No, I found that out much later.
Yeah, that's what I figured. Yeah. And so how
Um,
did he explain it to you? Did he just, was this just a prescription and take this and see how it does?
Yeah, this was just a prescription for some medication that would help me keep my sexual urges under control.
Yeah.
Because in that position, like, they make you out to feel that any sexual urge that you're experiencing is some deviancy, and if you can't keep yourself under control, then maybe you're a sex addict. And it's like, well, no, maybe you're just a teenager with raging hormones.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
exactly.
So can I ask, because I think it's a really important point. He said he was experimenting with medication on other brethren young people, but hadn't had any success. Is that what you said?
Yeah, and he didn't go into any detail, and I had no idea who those young people might be. But it was very clear to me that I was not the only person
Yeah.
that was being treated in this way.
Yeah,
Wow.
we know of the other case. We know of one other case. But that's,
That was more recent though, wasn't it, Lane?
I think it actually would have been around the same time frame,
Oh, okay.
because the other case referenced the priests in this other case
This is North America.
in North
Yeah.
America. Yeah.
Yeah.
The priests told him that they'd had success with Craig.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's news to
Yeah.
me.
exactly. These fucking people. Like, they just lie through their teeth. But yeah, I heard that too, and that's awful, because why is a radiologist experimenting with this drug? Never. You should never be allowed to do that. The word experiment should never be in a radiologist's mouth that's prescribing drugs.
Gosh.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
mind-blowing, isn't it? It really is.
So
And-
can you tell us what happened to that doctor, Craig?
Well, several years later, after I had left the Brethren, finally, I was back in Sydney with a film crew from Channel 7, and we confronted Mark Craddock in the street. This footage is on YouTube.
We're going to post a link.
Excellent. So we confronted Mark Craddock in the street, and the reporter questioned him really closely on what he had done, what he had prescribed. And he tried to claim doctor-patient confidentiality, and just like, your patient's right here. He consents.
Yeah.
Yes, and we'd also gone, it was quite a mission trying to get a copy of that prescription. But we basically sort of remembered roughly where it had been, and we just went driving around the streets until we recognized a pharmacy, basically. It was a bit of a needle in a haystack operation,
Wow.
but we succeeded. And so that was quite sort of damning footage, I think, of Mark Craddock admitting the situation. And subsequent to that, I laid a complaint with the New South Wales Healthcare Complaints Commission, which investigated and found him guilty of various breaches of good practice, and following that he was barred from practicing as a GP, which effectively cut him off as a source of medication for the brethren.
Thank goodness.
But of course I was well out of the brethren by this point, so I'm not privy to how they reacted to that, but I don't imagine it went down well.
That judgment is online. You can actually look it up and read the kind of the minutes and the judgment of the hearing, and that they barred him and what he'd done, and you can see that he's trying to protect other people. He's sort of, someone told him to do this, but he's not going to say who it was, which I assume is Bruce Hales. Yeah,
that was the one factual element of my complaint that he refused to concede, was that I'd seen him on the orders of Bruce Hales. And looking more broadly at some of these things, I mean, it comes back to that central belief that the man of God must be protected above all else.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, and even in that news channel and that that's on YouTube, he very much talks about you going to him involuntarily, like you're doing it voluntarily, that you went on your own and you were looking for help. And I mean, any ex-member who watches those knows that that's just a bunch of lies.
I mean, as I've dealt with this and sort of talking to various government agencies here about other policies that are being implemented, following on, because New Zealand recently passed a ban on conversion therapy, and I said this is a common argument, especially from religious groups, is that people are doing things of their own free will. And if you believe that, in the brethren's case, the man of God can do no wrong and that he is the literal embodiment of God on earth, if the man of God even makes a vague suggestion that you should do something, if you action that suggestion, you're not doing it out of free will. You're doing it out of genuine fear that if you don't follow through, then you're rejecting God's will for you.
Yeah, but they'll die on the sword. They'll just be like, no, it was my choice. It was my choice. That was the case with the attack ads taken out against Trudeau, the Prime Minister here in Canada. And then, they tracked it down to the Plymouth Brethren member did it. And he's like, yeah, it was just me. It was just me. That was like one of the first things he said, right? Just me.
It was the same in New Zealand. The New Zealand 7 who orchestrated the attack on Helen Clark, they had a meeting with Bruce Hales, a long private meeting just prior to all that political activity. And then they all come out and say, oh no, this was just a group of concerned businessmen acting off our own initiative, because everyone knows perfectly well that no one in the Brethren would dream of, I mean, you can't even move house without the guy's permission. So are you really going to set up a whole political campaign costing millions of dollars without consulting with the Grand Poobah?
Of course not.
I mean, it's so false, and yet they lie so glibly about it. It's shocking.
Yes, the election campaign, that just reminds me, in New Zealand, we campaigned quite heavily through the 2005 election. Then the 2008 election rolled around and they came out and told us that we weren't to be involved in politics at all. And this was like such a bone of contention for me. And I was on my way out by this point, and I kept asking questions after the meetings. I was like, well, if it's wrong to campaign in 2008, does that mean it was also wrong to campaign in 2005? Because I was like, we all knew that we were doing that under orders from the man of God.
Yeah.
It's like, how could it be right then and wrong now? And then they said that the line that I remember is they asked Tony McCorkell for the church's stance on voting. And he was the publicity person at that point, and he told the New Zealand Herald that voting was a matter of personal conscience for members of the Brethren, and that if they wanted to know whether or not the Brethren would be voting, they'd have to individually ask every single member in New Zealand.
Oh,
Which is just that's absolute bullshit, and we all know that. But I thought, okay, I'll put this to the test. And so I went and voted, and then told everyone at the meeting that I'd voted in line with my conscience.
That's awesome. Did the jaws just drop?
Well, yeah, there was just like a lot of awkward shuffling of feet.
Oh, that's so funny.
Well, the fact is that brethren members don't have an individual conscience.
No.
They just have a collective conscience, which is dictated by the church.
So this is getting closer and closer to you almost leaving, right? You're getting there. What point? How old are you at this point? We got a little sidetracked.
19 at this point.
Okay.
And yeah, I came back to New Zealand after having been in Sydney, and Bruce Hales had left me with various dire warnings about how bad my life would be if I ever followed through with being gay. But it became very clear to me back in New Zealand, and as the sort of subsequent 6 months or so unfolded, that there was no future for me in the exclusive brethren, and that whatever happened, if I left, no matter how bad my life got, it couldn't possibly be any worse than what I was faced with.
Yeah.
If I had stayed in. But for me, it was quite a deliberate process. I knew that I was going to leave, and so I spent quite a long time building the groundwork for that, and sort of working through saying goodbye to people and collecting. It's all those things that you don't necessarily think about top of mind, like all your baby photos, pictures from your childhood. And so I was quite careful about collecting those things, and gradually building networks outside of the brethren as well. And I was quite lucky to have a lot of relatives on the outside, uncles and aunts and my grandfather and so on. And ultimately, need to remember my sort of timing of events here, but the long and short of it was that I eventually called a meeting with the priests. I had been on a road trip. I went on a road trip around the North Island of New Zealand, which for me was a farewell tour. And so I went around seeing people for the last time, not that they knew it.
Yeah.
And I had preached, and the Invercargill had by this point long since stopped asking me to preach. But honest, they knew I was troubled, but of course the good folks in Masterton had no idea, and asked me to preach on a Sunday evening, the 5 p.m. gospel. And I just thought this was too good of a chance to pass up.
I actually read about this. This is funny.
Oh, I'm dying to hear this.
So I forget the verse that I read. I would need to look it up, but it was about the light of the assembly, and I said that light, if you broke it down, was made up of all the colours of the rainbow, and
Yes.
and that we needed to be accepting of diversity and all work together if we were to ever achieve the light of the assembly. And a few days after that, back in Invercargill, I called a meeting with the priests and said I was leaving.
You called them in. That's funny.
I called a meeting with them.
Yeah.
And said that I was leaving, and I didn't see any way forward. And I made very clear to them that I was leaving my position in the brethren, but I was not leaving my family. I was not leaving my job. I was not leaving my home. Which put them in a bit of a difficult position, because I refused to move out and refused to quit my job, and basically just carried on with my life, except I didn't go to church anymore.
Wow.
And I did actually go to one more meeting after that. My cousins got married a few days later, and the groom called me like 4 times the day before the wedding, begging me to come to the service. And I was like, you know what, like, throw a dog a bone. It's like actually no skin off my nose to go to this meeting. So anyway, the last meeting I went to was a wedding. And the priest sort of limped along from there. Their line was that I was mentally ill, and so I needed compassion. But that came to a head when I came out as gay to my brothers and sisters. Of course, up until this point, it had been something that the priests could keep under wraps, and they felt they had control of the information flow. But around this time, I started just coming out to people, and it was like clearly getting away from them. And coming out to my siblings was really what tipped it over the edge. So I came out to them, I think it was on a Friday afternoon, evening, and then I went out that night, and I woke up the next morning and all my siblings, bar one, had been removed from the house. And they wouldn't tell me where they'd gone. And the line from the priest at that point was very much that I had defiled my younger siblings by telling them that I was gay, and that they needed to take them out of the family home to protect them. And long story short, eventually I ended up being shut up, and a long process dragged out because I refused to move out. And I think I was trying to make a point that everything that was happening was not my choice, because as soon as you move out of their home, then they turn around and say, well, it was your choice to leave, you abandoned us. And I was really determined not to let that happen. And I said to my parents the whole way through, I'll move out anytime, but I want you to put in writing and explain why you're kicking me out.
Wow, good for you.
FYI, for anyone in there listening right now, here's your to-do list.
Yeah.
This
and
is
I'd
genius.
and I'd also been refusing to meet with the priests after that, because I'm not part of your group anymore. You have no power over me.
Yeah.
And this is the other thing to anyone who's still in there, is like, you actually don't have to talk to the priests. You're not legally obliged to meet with them at all. You can just tell them to go away.
Yeah,
Exactly.
But
and you don't have to quit your job.
No, absolutely. You don't even have to move out. The only thing that you're giving up is your membership of the Brethren. And I know that they have all of these conditions around what that means, but those conditions are their arbitrary interpretation. It's up to you whether you accept them. Of course, we all know what the end result will be, but I'd been refusing to meet with the priests, and they kept saying they wanted to talk to me, and I went back to them and I said, look, I'll meet you, but I have conditions. And I said, I'll meet you if you agree. First of all, you need to provide a written agenda. And second of all, I'm going to bring an independent witness to balance the stakes. And I said, you need to agree that you won't put any pressure on my family as a result of anything I say, and that you won't interfere with my living arrangements or my employment. And you also need to agree, I said they needed to agree that everything they said was as representatives of the Brethren Church, because so often their weasel out is, well, that was individuals, but those individuals don't represent the Brethren. I said, I'm not seeing you unless you agree in writing that you're representing the Brethren. Of course, they wouldn't meet any of these conditions for quite some time. But then I was on the front page of one of the local papers promoting a rainbow support group, which sort of put them into a bit of a bind because I was shut up, but I wasn't withdrawn from. And they kept just having to go back to the assembly and saying, oh, no progress. And they couldn't really go back to the assembly and say no progress after I'd been on the front page of the paper. They had to be some kind of progress.
That is amazing.
And I said to them, well, you know what my conditions are. And eventually they met them.
Wow.
So they agreed that they were representing the Brethren in Invercargill and agreed that they were not going to put any pressure on my parents, and provided a written agenda, and I took a witness. And it was just quite funny. The witness that I took was a friend, but she had previously been a choir teacher at the Brethren School. So she knew exactly how they operated.
Yeah.
And I think it was quite a shock to them when she showed up.
That's funny.
But she just did everything she could to like put them on the back foot. And when you've got someone, it's very easy for people, even when you've left, it's very easy to fall into sort of doing things their way. And I think she was just there to disrupt their way and to show that actually there's a very different way of doing this. So we sat down. It was like me and two priests and my friend, who was a very vocal woman, which was like out of the gate, not something they were used to.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah, we were in the boardroom at one of their businesses, and we were about to meet, and she looked at them and she says, "Have you gentlemen prayed about this?"
Right out of the gate. That's hilarious.
And they hadn't. And so she said, "Oh, well, let's all pray."
And this is a female doing this.
That's amazing.
They got up and walked out.
No. What? What?
And so like, she and I just sat there in the boardroom at this business and just like prayed aloud for guidance as we met with the
Oh, they come back in after a bit?
So when we had finished praying, I came back in.
Okay. Oh my God.
Did you suggest a hymn at that point, or?
Yeah, oh hark, happy saints.
Oh, gee.
So they come back in, and now what do you say to them?
Well, I mean, it just kind of descended from there. I mean, they were trying to claim that the issue was that I had become a member of another organization. And it's like, what are you on about? Like, you knew a year ago that I was a member of my local gym, and that clearly wasn't a problem.
A gym membership?
Yes.
What is up with the Plymouth Brethren and hating exercise?
But no, it just went round in circles, and they didn't really have anywhere that they could take it from there, other than sort of providing that assurance that they wouldn't get involved in my sort of living or employment circumstances. But in the end, and this is a difficult thing, is I think the indoctrination is so strong for members now that the church can take a step back and not actually have to apply any control, and members will just carry on enforcing the rules anyway.
Absolutely, yeah.
Like, I doubt very much whether any priests got on the phone to my parents and were like, "You must kick out Craig." I'm sure my parents, with their hardline interpretation of Brethren doctrine, were quite capable of coming to that point on their own.
Yeah.
So I don't doubt that it was led by my parents rather than the priests. But it eventually ended, as I knew it would, with me being kicked out. And they waited until I was away for the weekend. And then the day I was in Adelaide, I was in Australia, and the day before I flew back to New Zealand, I had a phone call from my dad saying that I wasn't welcome back in their house. And they had cleared out all of my belongings and put them in a storage unit in town. And that when I got back to Invercargill, I should contact them for the key to the storage unit.
Wow.
Holy cow.
No reason given.
Well, my way of life was incompatible with theirs.
Right.
And I always knew that it would reach this point, but to me it was really important to drive it to that point, to demonstrate ultimately where they stood.
That it's them and not you.
Yeah, exactly. That was a really important point for me to make. And and that was sort of really the beginning of the end with them. After that point, of course, when you're thrown out into the outside world like that, I was lucky that I'd already been building friendships and connections on the outside, so there were people there to support me. But it's still an intensely traumatic experience. And that final sort of ripping of the band-aid happens.
Yeah.
So can I just go back a little bit? So from the day your siblings were removed from the house overnight, when you came out to them as being gay, they never returned and lived in your parents' house with you after that?
Well, it was a little bit complicated. So they removed my siblings from the family home and tried to shut me up. And so the Brethren still have quite an unusual system where if an assembly judgment is pronounced, it still technically requires unanimous agreement. Everyone needs to say amen.
Yeah.
And the first time they tried to shut me up, the assembly didn't agree.
Oh, wow, that's amazing.
That's a first, yeah.
Yeah, I think there was like 8 brothers who spoke out and like, let's just like show some more grace. Which put the priests in a bit of a bind because they'd played their hand and failed. And I think also at this point, Bruce Hales had perhaps become aware that I was trouble. And so he was very hands off. He was saying that basically, I'm not getting involved. Like it's up to the local assembly to decide what to do, which is just, as I see it, passing the buck, really. So when they failed to shut me up, my siblings did all come back, which was quite a bizarre experience because I'd just gone through this like extreme grieving process of losing them, and then they all reappeared. And so that was that really messed with my head, and I couldn't really connect with them after that, having gone through the process of
Grieving and knowing that you're going to leave them again. Yeah.
Wow, that must have been traumatic.
Yeah.
But they really weaponize your loved ones against you. That's their MO, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, I was old enough to understand what was happening, but my youngest sister was 8 or 9 at the time.
Yeah.
And she didn't really have any comprehension of what was going on. And I just remember, conversations with her about what was happening and her just pleading with me to change my mind, and how sad she would be if she couldn't see me anymore. And I remember trying to tell her that I wouldn't be a part of the Brethren anymore, and she's like, but if you're not in the Brethren, that means I'll never see you again because you'll go to hell, and so I won't see you in heaven either. And I remember one night, this like poor little kid came and like knocked on my bedroom door 3 times in one evening, basically pleading with me not to go. And at one point she offered me like all the money in her savings if I agreed to stay, and all of these, just this like heartbreaking bargaining.
Wow.
Yeah.
And have you ever had contact with them since you've left?
No,
No. Yeah.
is a
Yeah.
short answer. I mean, I've been back through Invercargill at various points. So when I went to Invercargill a couple of years after leaving, and tried to see my grandmother, my dad called ahead and told her not to open the door, and then threatened to call the police if I didn't get off the property. I've had some very tentative, there have been things when my grandmother died, for instance, where there's sort of been brief contact in passing. But in terms of any meaningful or emotional reconnection, no.
Yeah.
Other than when my brother left about 7 years after me.
Oh, that's awesome. I didn't know that. It's amazing.
So I know you have to go, but I want to kind of wrap this up with something a little positive. So going through what you went through, how would you consider your life outside the Brethren now?
Oh, my life's incredible. And I was, maybe just one more story. I was incredibly fortunate after I left. So 60 Minutes did a documentary about me in 2009, December 2009. And based on that experience, the reporter and producer from 60 Minutes sat me down and asked what I wanted to do with my life and recommended that I become a journalist. And took me into TV3, the station that aired 60 Minutes, and introduced me to their executive producer and told me to go and travel the world and come back and let them know what I decided. So I did that, and I spent a year traveling the world, which is when I met Lane.
Yeah.
And came back and said to them, yeah, I think I would like to be a journalist. And so 60 Minutes wrote me a letter of recommendation to get into university, and then gave me a job as a first-year student, and I've been in journalism ever since.
Wow.
That's amazing.
That's
Good for
incredible.
you. Good for
That's
you.
so incredible.
And the 60 Minutes reporter who had told my story, Sarah Hall, she ended up being so moved by the interaction telling my story that she and her husband took me in and became my adoptive parents.
No way. That's amazing. Oh, this is such an awesome ending.
See, and this
to a
that
story.
is I mean, because we know that there's quite a ruckus going on inside with what they're considering calling these disturbed young ones that are, following our advice. It's just stories like yours, Craig, that really can show people that there is such a huge life out here, and that even though it's scary, I guarantee you there's always going to be someone who has your back, and they just come out of nowhere.
Yeah, and I think growing up in the Brethren, I was told that the Brethren were the only place that I would find love and acceptance, and that the world was a cold, hard place. And I think leaving really brought home to me that the opposite is true.
Yeah.
When I was thrown out, I found that people I had known and loved my whole lives turned their backs on me, and complete strangers were there to open their homes and show me the love and compassion that I'd been promised by the Brethren.
So true.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
So true.
And just for anyone listening, we will attach the links to those reporters, the YouTube videos. We'll put in the description. We'll add the link to those so everybody can watch those, because they're very informational. They're very heart-wrenching. Yeah.
Craig,
Well, thank you so much,
much.
Craig, for joining us. And you're welcome on any time, because I'm sure you're full of stories from all of your journeys and your time inside Sydney. So make sure you keep in touch, and we would love to have you back on again.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
To share your story or be a guest on the show, email info.getalife@proton.me.